So I'm the least boundaried person that I know. So not the least boundaried person, but I'm pretty bad. And it's, to be honest, it was definitely an issue in my relationship with my wife because my wife is a very boundaried person, and it was just night and day the way we thought about things and the way we related to things. And we're going to get into all that tonight because there's two very important aspects of boundaries. There's the giving and setting of boundaries, and then there's the receiving of boundaries. So some of us in our relationship have only been the person who sets boundaries, right? And then their other half are the ones who receive the boundaries. And then some of us have been in both situations where we set the boundary and we receive boundaries. So they're both important things to discuss and to talk about because they're both not easy. Being the giver or the receiver of boundaries can be tough, both of them. So we'll get into both of those things too. And one of the things I asked was that people come with certain examples of situations where they've had a hard time setting boundaries, or they failed at setting boundaries, or maybe even examples where boundaries worked for them. So that'd be great if you guys can be thinking about that kind of like in the back of your head as we're talking. That would be nice because it always fleshes out the class a little bit when people bring examples from their own personal life. So, okay, I think I'm going to start basically, and whoever comes in will just enjoy. So my name is David Feldman, and I'm a marriage and family therapist. You can find me primarily on Twitter at David Feldman, like most of you have. I do work from Chicago as well as over the internet and over the phone, over Zoom. I work primarily with couples and singles in relationships that are looking to have a long-lasting, committed, loving relationship. So that's my area of expertise. Let's see. I've been a therapist for starting my journey has been about 10 years now. I've had a previous existence as an IT specialist, which I still do. Something has to pay the bills. But my passion is helping people have great relationships. And so that's what I love to do. So I'm really happy that everybody showed up tonight. And let's go. Let's start our class. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is let's all agree on what a definition of a boundary is. What is it when you heard that we were going to be talking tonight about setting boundaries? Probably everybody has different understanding of what that word and what that concept really means. I'd like for us to standardize on a general definition. So I'm going to ask whoever wants to, like maybe Craig wants to, or maybe Mark, or maybe Sherry, or maybe Annabelle and Josh. Maybe you want to share with me what you think a boundary actually is. What does it mean to you when you think to yourself, oh, I've got to set a boundary, or something like that? Who here has some sort of working definition?
I would say it's something that within your soul, kind of soul knowing that where you're convicted on certain things, and not allowing someone else's situation or need to determine or deter you from your own intuition and knowing.
Okay, good. I like that. So having a self-conviction, having a self-understanding, a self-awareness, and you're saying that it comes from like a soul level. So like not necessarily only emotional or not necessarily intellectual, but like a deeper kind of sense of right and wrong and what's right for you. And one of the functions of a boundary is to not allow somebody else's culture, need, personality, any of the above to kind of impinge upon what your personal belief about what is right for you. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Good. Excellent. I like that. I like that a lot. Mark, do you have any ideas that you'd like to share with us about what a boundary is?
For me, I would say a boundary is, it can be a couple of things, but one thing that comes to mind is knowing what can potentially trigger someone and not crossing that boundary. Like if it was a past wound of theirs or past trauma, trying your best not to do something that's going to evoke that old emotion, that old past, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it would be kind of protecting yourself from it would kind of be protecting yourself from experiences which could trigger old wounds that come up for you. Did I get that correct?
Exactly.
Good. I like that. I like that a lot. Okay, good. Okay, who else has a working definition of what a boundary is? Hi, honey. Mrs. America just entered the room. Sherry, do you have one? Yeah, let's see if I can unmute you. Where'd you go? Here you are.
Thank you. I couldn't find the button.
No problem.
Okay, so the definition of a boundary. Well, we discussed this last week. So it is something you will not allow somebody to do to you or with you.
Uh-huh. Okay. Good. So it's and Meryl, you can hear me, right? Okay, good. Okay, you're in. Okay, good. Yes, and that is going to be my definition of a boundary. I think the definitions that Craig shared and that Mark shared are 100% spot on, but I like to take it to its most simple level, which is a boundary is a way to define how I will no longer be treated. In its simplest definition, it is how I will no longer be treated. Okay. I think that what Mark said is really true. It does. One of the reasons why we set up boundaries is to protect ourselves from childhood wounds or from other traumas that we've had or bad experiences. 100%. We're going to talk about that. And I think what Craig said, which is, that it stems from somewhere inside that kind of is like this primal sense of what's comfortable for me. Craig, I thought that was great. That's really true. But the bottom line is that at its most fundamental level, it is basically a statement or a belief or an attitude or an expressed desire or a limit, which basically says I will no longer be treated, or I will not be treated in such a way. Okay, that's what a boundary is. We set boundaries when we feel that we're being, in our perspective, mistreated. And what that means is that, like what Craig and Mark were saying, mistreated could mean a whole bunch of things. It could mean that I'm not comfortable with it. It could mean that this is a reflection of a childhood wound. It could mean that this is just not something that I feel is right, maybe right or wrong. It could be all different types of things. But nonetheless, a boundary is a way that is something that I set up to protect myself, to not be treated in a certain way. And this is opposed to, let's just say, an expectation or a desire. A desire is the opposite of a boundary, even though they both deal with interaction. A desire is a way that I want to be treated, right? Now, one of those I can control, and one of those I cannot control. Right? I can control how I'm not being treated, but I can't control how I am being treated. So, for instance, I can control, let's just say, the way somebody speaks to me, right? I can control what I do with my time, how much time the other person can take up from my calendar, right? I can control conversations that I want to have or that I don't want to have. So let's say you have a friend who constantly talks to you about politics and you just do not want to talk about politics, right? So that's something you can control. What you can't control is something like, I want to be treated more lovingly, or I want my partner to take out the dog, right? So, is an example of a not boundary that sometimes people get confused with is say, well, I'm setting a boundary that every night you have to take out the dog from between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, right? That's not setting a boundary. That's that's trying to tell somebody else what to do. And good luck with that. We have a whole other class on how to tell other people what to do, right? Or putting your socks in the basket. It's really important to me that I'm setting a boundary that from now on, when you take your socks off, they have to go directly in the laundry basket. That's not a boundary. Okay. What could be a boundary is, if the socks aren't in the basket, I won't wash your socks. That could be a boundary, because that's talking about how I'm going to behave. Right. So this is a very important distinction that we need to make, because oftentimes we confuse the two, and we use words or thoughts or ideas or concepts that are close in nature, but they're not. We always have to remember that we can never force our partner to show up in a certain way in terms of how they behave. The only thing we can do is control ourselves and our situation so that we are not treated in a way that we don't want to be treated. And that's a boundary. Okay? And boundaries aren't always with your partner. They can be anything. And people can put boundaries on themselves, right? That's called discipline. I will not wake up past 7 o'clock. I will not eat carbs. I will not, speak negatively to my spouse. These are all boundaries that we can put on ourselves and our own behavior. And those are good things. Okay. Does anybody have any questions, or does anybody disagree with the way I've laid out the differences between like a boundary versus a desire?
What's the correlation between a boundary and expectations?
Well, they're related. They're related because we're all talking about relationship behavior, right? So they're both within the same, let's say, the same genre, because they both talk about how we interact with each other, but they're really two different. They're kind of like the opposite sides of the same coin. One has to do with the way the other person is behaving, and one has to do with the way I'm behaving, because I'm responsible for my own boundaries. It's true that my boundaries have to do with your behavior, but ultimately I'm the one that can control that. I can control, if you speak to me a certain way, there's different ways I can control that. I can leave. I can put on a pair of headsets and not listen. I can ignore you. I can control that, right? But I can't control whether or not you put your socks in the basket or clean your dishes after dinner. I mean, I can ask you, which we can talk about which we've talked about in other classes, but I can't control that. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Hi, Miriam.
Hi.
Did you want to say
I
something?
Yeah, I wanted to say something from like a mind-body perspective. So when we put boundaries on ourselves and we want to make decisions about like what time we get up and that kind of thing, or we're not going to do something, that's kind of like a willpower thing. Like it's kind of like in our mind, we've decided I desire something, and so therefore I'm going to set like my willpower is going to drive me to get up at a certain time or behave in a certain way. You want to stop speaking critically to your spouse. So it would be like willpower. I'm going to stop myself from doing that. But from a mind body perspective, in terms of boundaries, if you go into the body, you'll feel something feels off when someone does something and you won't like it. And we're used to kind of being disconnected from our body and staying in our mind. So then we try to figure all kinds of stuff out in our mind. But if we drop into the body, then when someone does something that we don't like, we'll feel it. Like we'll feel a clenching in the jaw, we'll feel a constriction in the chest. And that's our body telling us like something doesn't feel good, something doesn't feel right. If someone speaks to you in a certain way, it'll be like maybe even a little shock in the body. And so that kind of gives us the signal that something doesn't feel good to us. At the same time, sometimes those, and that could be like, because anger is kind of setting a boundary. It's like when something has crossed our either emotional or physical kind of space that we feel violated in some kind of way. But sometimes we do need to look at like, sometimes, we might not like that, our spouse does something, like whether it's the laundry or something like that. And then we can also use our willpower and decide, well, gosh, that's just not something I really want to care about or whatever. And then we can use our mind for that. So just kind of interesting if you find something, when you want to set a boundary or you're noticing, like go into the body and just notice, what does it feel like when that person does that or says that? Where do I feel it in my body? And then from there, you can kind of start understanding like what to do with it. And then maybe it could be from the past, or maybe it could be presently, you don't like it. And then, but dropping into the body is just always a good thing to do.
That's great.
That.
Yeah, that's really great. That's really important. Yeah, understanding that it's a big part of what we do in our therapy work, and that's an important thing for everybody, including myself and everybody, to take a look at where's the origin of this boundary coming from. And I'll tell a funny story about that a little bit later, but that's a huge piece, and connecting to what feels good for you and what feels right for you is really important as well. So thank you for sharing that, Miriam. And basically, I want to just leverage off of what my wife said, and we can go into the next section, which is boundaries are difficult because boundaries in general are negative, right? Because they're things that we don't want have to be done to us. Usually they come from like my wife said, they come from a negative interaction. He did this and this doesn't feel good. She's doing this and I don't like it. And then setting boundaries means that you have to kind of stick up for yourself and change the dynamic. And that can be painful. It can be painful for you to do that, because who likes to do that, right? I'd rather hug and kiss my wife than say, hey, I don't like the way you're treating me, right? That's so much easier, but or if it's a work, something going on at work, like everybody just likes to bring donuts and have a good time and get the work done. No one likes to say, hey, you know what? You're being really obnoxious by the water cooler, cut it out, So setting boundaries is tough on the one who's setting it. And it's also very tough on the receiver. And that's a big deal, because the receiver, they're the instigator for the boundary, right? So I don't know who here is, I know I have been on the receiving end of somebody's I know I have been on the receiving end of a boundary being set, and it does not feel good. I mean, that's for sure, right? Has anybody else been on the receiving end of, okay. Yes. Yeah, other people have been on the receiving end also. It doesn't feel good, right? So I want to just share with you a deeper understanding of what boundaries are, so we can kind of feel better about it. Not only can we feel better about receiving them, but we can feel better about sending them as well, setting them as well. And this is the deeper understanding. If you think about what a boundary really is, okay, so I admitted that it's a way I won't be treated. But the question is, why? And the answer to that is because I love you. The reason why I'm setting a boundary is because I love you and I love us. It's because I want us to work. I want this relationship to work. I want to be in connection with you. I want to protect what we have. And if there's a behavior that's occurring that's disrupting our love, so I'm trying to stop it. I'm trying to protect us from the consequences of that negative behavior. I think Mark originally said it that you're trying to protect yourself from something that happened that was very uncomfortable. And no one wants that in a relationship. So if you think about boundaries in the physical world, perhaps the best boundary that we know is a bank vault, right? Or a jewelry case, right? These cases and these vaults are there not to distance you from your money, but to protect your money or protect the store so they can offer you jewelry. If we don't have boundaries, then everything falls apart. So the inner meaning behind a boundary is not to put, even though it feels like it's to push you away, and believe me, I know what that feels like. And I've also been the one to push people away as well. But that's not the real purpose of the boundary. The real purpose of boundary is to hug somebody even closer. So you shouldn't feel guilty about setting a boundary, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to make it work. Okay? That's just a thought I wanted to share with you to kind of Does anybody have a comment on that or a thought associated with that? Or okay.
I do. I have something to say.
Yes, Jolanda.
Hi, David. I when you were saying that in the beginning, it feels like you're pushing someone away, or it doesn't feel good to receive the boundary. That's very true. But I think like once you get over that initial feeling of that negative feeling, both people can kind of see that the boundary in place is for the betterment of the relationship.
Yes, 100%. And that's what you want, right? And that's why we're here at this class, because I'm going to be sharing with you what my ideas are on how to not easily, but more peacefully and lovingly set a boundary. Okay, good. Thank you, Jolanda, for sharing that. Okay, so now that we've set up this little framework and understanding of what boundaries are and kind of understanding the deeper meaning about them, I think it's fair to say in a very superficial way that boundaries are essentially. Sorry about that. I guess I got knocked off for a second. Okay. So now that we've set the framework here, boundaries can be a little bit aggressive, as I just stated. So it's basically, let's just put it this way: it's on a superficial level, it's an act of aggression in your relationship. It doesn't mean that it's misplaced. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, but it's an aggressive move, right? Anybody here who set a hard boundary probably has felt that level of adrenaline and aggression when they're doing it. They have to kind of build themselves up. They have to have the courage to do it. It's not like buying flowers for your wife. It's not like making your husband a nice meal. It's a negative act of aggression. And again, it's for a good purpose, as we talked about. But bottom line is that, sometimes a country having to go to war is important for the safety of the country, but it's still going to war. And that's kind of a little bit in a smaller way. That's kind of like what setting a boundary is. It's drawing the line in the sand and saying, we're changing things up. And that can be difficult, right? So therefore, we need to do it very sensitively. That's the reason why I'm saying it. It's paramount that if you want to be successful at setting boundaries in your relationship, that it needs to be done sensitively. And what that means is that, as I explained to one of my clients the other day, it is not our number one go-to, right? If your spouse is doing something you don't like, you don't immediately respond with the nuclear bomb of setting a harsh boundary. That's not what we do, right? We could do that, and you could have the desired result, but ultimately that's not going to serve your relationship well. So what do we do instead, right? So we're feeling mistreated. We're feeling like something's wrong. We're feeling violated. It could be all these different things. So how do we handle it, right? I mean, the easiest way to handle it, like I said, is just to set a boundary. Burst into the room and say, never do that to me again, or if you ever do that to me again, I'm going to leave, or I'm going to, who knows what, I'm going to paint the walls pink, or whatever your consequences are for the boundaries. Yeah, we could do that. And you might get your way, right? But you're going to get your way at the expense of trust, because your partner is going to think that you're like a little bit of a a psychopath, like that's just totally unhinged, and they're not going to want to be themselves around you because this person's highly volatile. So the first thing we want to do when there's something that's happening in our relationship that's unpleasant to us is to, as we learned in first grade, ask nicely, right? We want to request change, right? So, and you would be surprised at how many people, I know that everybody says, oh, I did that already, but you would be surprised at how many couples I work with, how many individuals I work with that don't ask nicely and that don't have that as their number one go-to for whatever reason. Instead, what they do is they get mistreated, then they get mistreated again, then they get mistreated again. They don't say anything, they get mistreated again. And then by the fourth or fifth time, they totally explode on their partner, and their partner's like, whoa, like what on earth is going on over here? How many people have been in that situation? Either you were the one that completely exploded on your partner and you never, Craig, I see you raised your hand, right? Or you were the one that received like this huge volcano eruption from your partner. You're just like, whoa, you could have just added. Right, Jolanda, you see that you resonate with that as well, right? So the first thing we need to be comfortable with is asking our partners for change. No big deal. Again, you'd be surprised at how many, especially women, they tend to not say anything. They tend to just take it and take it and take it and take it. And then they just don't talk to anybody about it. Or maybe they talk to their girlfriends about it. And next thing you know, they erupt, right? So we don't want to do that. Our first thing is to ask nicely. When I say ask nicely, you ask in a positive way. And asking in a positive way could be, let's just use the example of putting socks in the hamper. Let's just use that as an example. Hey, you know what? It's really important to me that the room is clean, and I'm just wondering if this is something that you can pay attention to. Please just make sure that when you take off your socks or your dirty clothes, you put them in the hamper. Just something as simple as that. No blaming. I noticed I didn't blame him. I didn't call him an idiot. I didn't call him a slob. I didn't call him any names. I didn't say, how could you do this to me? I didn't say, when you put your socks on the floor, you're making me pick it up for you. None of that stuff. That's not called asking nicely, right? So we want to ask nicely, right? So that's our first go-to. And as my father once said to me, when I was talking to him about when I was educating my son, and I said to my father, like, I keep on having to ask my son to do something. My father started laughing hysterically. He goes, he's like, you know how many thousands of times I asked you to do things for me? You know how many thousands of times I had to ask you to take out the garbage? He's like, it's just part of life. Asking once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, it's part of life. Just needs to get used to it, right? It doesn't mean you have to ask indefinitely, but part of asking nicely means understanding that it takes time, because you're asking for a behavior change, and behavior change is difficult. Okay. Anybody have a comment on this so far? Okay. Yeah. So the next step after asking nicely would be to ask not nicely. No, what that means is asking in the negative. Right. So first we ask in the positive. And by the way, let's give a couple more examples of positive. So when you give an example of a positive, or when we ask in the positive, we say things like what it would mean to me. It would make me happy if you did this. I would really appreciate if you did this. It would mean so much to me if you did this. Always make it personal. Don't make it about it's only right to put your socks in the bin, or it's only right to put your dishes, to wash your dishes before you go to bed, because it's not only right. Your partner will start fighting with you and tell you that there's a million people who don't do this, or I had a reason for this, or this is what makes sense, or this is how I grew up. You want to avoid all that. You just want to say, this is what it would mean to me. It means the world to me if this is it. This is important to me. Okay. The next thing is we want to ask in the negative, right? So now we're escalating a little bit, right? So asking in the negative would be telling the person that it's bothering you that they're not abiding by this it's not yet a boundary, by this request that you have. So it really disturbs me that you leave the refrigerator open. Okay, that's a bad example because that everyone is, but it really disturbs me that you don't put the car in the driveway at night and instead you park it on the street, right? It really disturbs me that you don't lock up all the doors with the double locks before you go to bed at night. I'm really bothered by this. This isn't working for me, right? I'm really upset that this is happening. Okay, so you're escalating when you do that, right? So now your partner is realizing this just isn't a wish of yours, but this is something that's very problematic for you and very bothersome. It bothers me that you don't put your keys in a place that you remember, and I always have to look for them. I always have to help you try to find them on your way out the door. It's really disturbing to me, right? Since I am so unboundaried, I could come up with thousands of examples of boundaries that I have violated and ways in which I have disturbed not just my family, but people in general. It's just, it really bothers me that you show up 10 minutes late to everything. It really bothers me that it just goes on and on and on. But it's important for us to learn how to express ourselves in the negative, right? Again, without blame. You're not saying the person's wrong. You're not saying the person's an idiot. You're not calling the person a name. You're just sharing a feeling. This action that you're doing is very disturbing to me. That's a very important point. We're not saying, hey, you're a moron for not putting this away every night, or hey, I don't know anybody who does that, or hey, if I were to tell people what you do, you'd be really embarrassed. Like, none of that stuff. That's not what we're doing over here. We're just sharing how it feels for us personally when in a negative way. So that's escalating. Okay. Now part of the assignment for coming to class tonight was to think about some sort of boundaries that you have either been set on you or you have set. Does anybody have an example of how before the boundary was given, they were given a couple chances in like a nice way or not nice way?
The socks in the clean room, that's the one. Even now, it's still kind of like trigger a little bit of emotion. Like, okay, just last week I had to say like, okay, I just cleaned the room. Please, can you just put your shoes over there, put your socks over here, in a nice way.
Good for you. Good, that's nice, right? Good, excellent. And Craig, do you have any examples for us?
Where do I start? The main one has to do with my reactivity to our children.
Uh-huh.
And though I guess the way we co-parent, and the differences that come alongside that, and that's the balancing act that I've tried to endure for so long, is being supportive, but yet watching the same things happen over and over again that mom complains about, and trying to find a way to say nicely, you're the one that allows that to happen. But yet still trying to be supportive, and then not lose your lid when those situations happen.
Uh-huh. So you're saying that what you're noticing is that your wife would get upset about something, and what's going on for you in your mind is, well, if you only implemented boundary A, B, or C, none of this would have happened in the first place. And at the same time, you want to still be in her good graces. So you have to be like, oh, okay, I see. I'm happy to help. Da, 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 da. Even though what's going on for you is, if you would have only listened to me in the first place, you wouldn't have gotten yourself into this mess.
And maybe not just listen to me, but followed and been consistent with your own advice.
Uh-huh. I see. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I could go on.
The pleasures of married life, right? Yeah. Okay. Good. Annabelle, you got anything for us?
She left diabolically before we.
Yeah, there's been, quite a few instances, like David, you were saying earlier, that, it could be a female trait that we don't confront it right away when we're uncomfortable.
Right.
And so after multiple times, it's like bottlenecking, and then and that's when I would erupt. And, it doesn't make the situation better. I certainly felt better the moment I erupted, but it lasted like a split of a second, and then the situation worsened. So it's like, the price, is not worth it. But I also appreciate what Miriam was saying earlier, is to like recognize, when my boundaries violated. Especially for me, I feel like it's not very clear to me a lot of the times when my boundary is violated, but my body would know before I can intellectually communicate it or even be aware of it.
Right.
Yeah. And then so it's like, and then also, I think having my boundaries violated can sometimes feel very similar to like something inside of me is triggered, and I think it's like, I don't know, yeah. So it's like something I'm like trying to be aware of, like which is which.
Right. It's very important. Very important. Yeah. And in reality, it doesn't really matter. As the partner of somebody who wants to erect a boundary, it's not up to us to decide or to validate whether this boundary makes sense or not, or whether this boundary is smart, or this boundary is logical or consistent or anything. It's not up to us, right? It's up to us to choose to respect, if possible, our partner's boundaries. That's our choice, right? So it is up to the person who's setting the boundary to be aware, because that's about themselves. That's about their own growth and their own self-development. We don't want to be setting boundaries in life that are a result of some stupid thing that happened a long time ago, or even a painful thing and a legitimate, valid thing. And I use the word stupid. I mean, it could have been something simple, or it could have been something that's even very meaningful or impactful, I should use the word, that happened a long time ago. We don't want to be carrying our past into our present relationships. It's not fair to us, and it's not fair to our partner, right? So if we're setting a boundary based on something that happened in the third grade, it's not really something that we want to be doing for ourselves or for our partner, right? But that's on the person who's setting the boundary. The one who's receiving it, if possible, their job is to say, okay, I don't like this. It doesn't feel good, but I'm willing to do this for you. I'm willing to do this for us, right? That's their job. Good. Excellent.
David, I wanted to say something, if
Please.
I could.
Yes.
So, Annabelle, and this goes for anyone who kind of needs, if they get triggered, just something that they can do about it. So I call it the roar process, and I do it with my clients, and I do it for myself, because sometimes I'll feel like if my husband or one of my kids or even the neighbor or someone else does something that feels bad to me, and I feel emotionally triggered. So I will kind of just take paper, and I will just, because it's really important to get really honest with yourself and then process what you're experiencing. So I will take paper, scrap paper, and I'll just like scribble on the scrap paper, just to get out of my mind and my heart, like what's going on in there. Because I might have a strong emotion. I might be saying, oh my gosh, they're so stupid. How could they do that again? But obviously I don't want to go to them and say that, because that breaks the relationship and that breaks trust. But I will allow myself to be super honest with myself and express it to myself. So that's when I take paper and I'll write, and then I'll rip it up. And then sometimes I'll have like a little temper tantrum. I'll just feel that sensation in my body. Where's that anger? And I'll get large with it. I'll get big with it. I'm doing this in the bathroom, or I'm doing this in my office. I'm doing something like this where it's private. But then after I've done that and I've processed it, then I can kind of either hear from my intuition or just use my mind to know, okay, how do I want to deal with this? Like, do I want to say anything? Do I not want to say anything? How should I say something? And it's like what David says, he's going to give us tools about how to communicate. But if you have a strong triggering emotion, you don't have to suppress it, because that can lead to health issues and stuff like that. So I call it the roar process. It's like it's writing and then the ripping and then opening the mouth, then just like grounding, grunting, growling, like rawr. It's like, or a silent scream. And then like just kind of having a temper tantrum like a little kid. And then that way you've processed it in your body. So when you're going to come to the person that you might be setting the boundary with, you're going to be a lot calmer and cooler, and you haven't suppressed it. So that's just an option.
Awesome. It's really, really important. Yeah. All of the tools that I have on my website and here that we've talked about in Masterclasses, they're all dependent on us kind of owning our own feelings. It's like a basic principle. And as long as we're agitated and we're in fright and flight and mode, we're not owning our feelings. We're projecting something onto our partner, whether it's blame, stupidity, jerkiness, whatever the thoughts are that we have about our partner, we're projecting that onto them, and they're going to feel that. Right? If they feel that, the conversation is going to go south. I don't care. There's no tools that you can put in place that's going to override body language and emotional energy that implies that they're a moron and a jerk for the way they're behaving. So what we need to do is we need to go through some sort of personal process where we kind of come clean with our emotions, and that's really important. It's really important. Our partner is never our punching bag. Never, ever, ever, ever. If you want to have a happy marriage, our partner is never our punching bag. Can't be. So we always have to own our own feelings, remove the guilt and blame, shame, all that stuff, and approach our partner from a way. And it doesn't mean that you're a saint. It just means that you've kind of thought through it and said to yourself, you know what? I married somebody who's reasonable. I'm reasonable. Let's get to let's get to the solution. Okay. So now you asked nicely, that didn't work. You asked not so nicely, that didn't work. What do you do now? Now it's time to set a boundary. Okay. Now the overriding principle in setting a boundary is what we're not trying to do is punish our partner. That's not what a boundary is about. A boundary isn't about punishing our partner. A boundary is best set when we know what we want from this situation. Okay? A boundary is best set when we know what we want from this situation. So let's go back to the case of asking the kids to clean the room, or putting the socks in the laundry basket, or parking the car. Parking the car is not a great one. That's not a good example. But let's see, putting the keys by the front door, because let's just say, having a husband who loses his keys all the time, that's me, and putting the keys by the front door, right? So what do we want in those situations? Well,
or David, if you could say it in the like what you had said earlier in the beginning of the class, it's like asking someone to stop doing something. So some of these are like you want them to do something different, but like maybe give some examples of someone's doing something that annoys you. And I guess like it's like the room has been cleaned and then someone dumped something in it. So then you're asking them to stop dumping stuff just in the middle of the room. But if you can use the word like what you want he's doing.
What I want somebody to stop doing. Right?
Yeah.
So okay, good. So I'll continue using the similar examples, but I'll just phrase it a little differently. Thank you, Miriam. So with regards to the example of the socks in the basket, what I don't want is I don't want the messy floor. That's what I don't want. Okay, that's what's bothering me. I don't really care where my partner puts their socks. I just don't want the socks on the floor where I have to see them. So if they put them in their drawer, if they put them in a lunch bag and they take them to work with them, I don't really care. I just don't want them on the floor. Okay, let's talk about the keys. So the keys, I don't care if my partner cannot find their keys. I just don't want to be asked to find their keys. That's the issue here. The issue isn't that my partner doesn't know where their keys are. The issue is that I don't want to be asked while I'm trying to get the kids out the door or do work, do whatever, to stop what I'm doing and help them look for their keys. Or let's use another example. Somebody give me an example of a boundary that they've had to set because they didn't want to be, we can use an example of being spoken to in a certain way. So certain people are in the habit of using, let's just say, swear words when they talk to their partner, or they're in the habit of yelling when they speak to their partner, or they're in the habit of being critical when they speak to their partner. So let's just say a partner says, I don't want to be spoken to when you're yelling at me, or I don't want to. So that's the issue. The issue is being yelled at, right? So that's what I don't want in the situation. That's really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for what is it how I don't want to be treated. That's my number one. What do I not want out of the situation? Because that's what the boundary is there to protect. Okay, does that make sense, Miriam? Okay. So when we come to set a boundary, the boundary has to revolve around that thing that we don't want. It's not about punishing your partner. It's not about changing your partner's behavior, right? Like I said before, my wife and I had a situation where I was always losing my keys, and I'd be rushing out of the house and I didn't know where they were. And I would go to Eagle Eyes, who always knew where everything was in the house, and say, help me find my keys. And she would say, she'd be in the middle of something. And even if she wasn't, I don't blame her. I mean, okay, 1 time, 2 times, once a month, twice a month, but every 3 days was a lot for her. And she didn't like it. So my wife did a lot of great things that I'm talking about. She asked me nicely. She asked me not nicely. She even did a further thing, which is she bought this special key hanger, and she nailed it to the wall right by the front door. She bought me a bowl that's sitting on a stand that's sitting right next to the front door. I can put my keys. I think my keys right now are my bedroom closet over there somewhere, even with all those things. Eventually, she said to me, I will no longer help you find your keys. I don't want you asking me anymore to find your keys. She didn't criticize me. She didn't say I was an idiot for the way I did it. She didn't look down on me. She didn't say, she just says, I've done everything I can do. At this point, I'm no longer going to be helping you find your keys. And when she said that to me, I was like, oh my gosh, like, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to find my keys? Well, and then all these other negative thoughts. So she doesn't love me. She doesn't care if I'm late to work. She doesn't care if I have things for me. She would help the kids find their things, but she's not helping me find my things. And all these things came up in my mind, which were all my things, which we're going to talk about later, how to receive boundaries properly. But what my wife did is she set up a situation, she set up a boundary where she drew a line as to behaviors that she no longer wanted to be doing, right? That's an example of setting up a boundary, okay? Again, there was no blame, there was no criticism, there was no nothing. She just cleanly said to me how she will no longer be treated, and that is that she wasn't willing to accept me asking her anymore for help finding my keys. Okay, nice and clean. Uncomfortable, but clean. Okay. Now, boundaries don't always have to be the refusal of behavior. They can also be an action that you take that gets the result that you were looking for. And I like to give this as an example. There was a period of time when I was coming home from we have 6 kids, thank God, and with all the blessings that those bring, it also brings a very messy house. So I would come home from work, and there was a time when a lot of them were like in their early to late teens, and a bunch of them were at home, and they made a mess. You have 4 or 5 teenagers, or three teenagers in the home. Maybe it was student break, whatever it was, but there's a huge mess in this house. So I go to work at 9, come home at 6, working hard the whole day. I'd walk into a house that was a disaster. These kids were lounging around, their feet on the this and that, the socks and shoes everywhere, jackets everywhere. So I asked nicely, please clean up your stuff. That didn't work. I asked not so nicely, hey, this is really bothering me that the house is so messy. Because the last thing I wanted to do was come home after a long day of work and have to clean up after my teenage kids in the home. Like, who wants to do that? I'm the one paying for everything here. They should be cleaning my room. I shouldn't be cleaning their room. Okay? I mean, it was unbelievable. One time I asked my daughter, after so many years of making food for her, as a joke, I said to her, hey, can you make me a sandwich? I mean, I have made thousands of meals for my daughter. So I said, hey, can you just, she was already making herself a sandwich. I said, hey, will you put one together? You should have seen the look on her face. Like, I was like, what? How dare you ask me to make you sandwich? Anyway, that's teenagers, right? So what I did, instead of getting angry, because I asked nicely, I asked not so nicely. So what I did, instead of getting angry, and instead of turning this into World War III, I set a boundary. And this was my boundary. When I come home, I'm going to clean up the house. The way I clean up the house is not going to be as fun and nice as the way you would want me to clean up the house. So what did I do? I walked downstairs to the basement. I grabbed a laundry basket, came upstairs, and anything I saw that was out of place, I don't care what it was, a dish, a glass with milk in it, a jacket, socks, homework, backpacks, rollerblades, you name it. I put it all in this basket. I didn't say anything to anybody. I just came with the basket. It literally took me about 3 or 4 minutes. Boom, 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 stuff in there. Brought it downstairs to the basement, plopped it down somewhere in the basement, and I came back upstairs and I was done. Okay. Some of these kids saw me do it. Some of them that I would hear later on, like, hey, did anybody see my backpack? Did anybody see my this, my that? I didn't say a word. Okay. So that was another way you can set a boundary, right? You don't have to get upset. You don't have to argue with people. You don't have to, stomp your feet. You don't have to say anything. I already asked nicely. I asked not so nicely. And now it's time for me to set my boundary. And sometimes a boundary requires you to take action. Okay. And the action is, for me, that was, I don't want a messy home. Right. So I did what I needed to do to not have a messy home. It's not nice. It is aggressive. I agree with that. It's not pleasant, but it's what I needed to do in order to make sure that I got my needs met, and that I didn't feel like I was totally violating their lifestyle, but it sent them a message. Okay, now I want anybody here to open up. I want to open up the conversation. So we have a few more things on the list, but I do want to give people a chance to share some of their experiences with boundaries. Has anybody set a boundary and had like negative backlash, or that boundaries that didn't work, or even boundaries that did work? I'd love to hear some stories about that. Jolanda, you want to share something with us?
I was waiting to give everybody else a moment to to talk, because I always have my hand is raised. I know, like, from the last time that I attended one of your classes, it was the communication workshop. I was focused on just how I was communicating my feelings, and so I worked on that some bit. But when I set the boundary of no longer participating in arguments that go like past like a certain octave, or once we kind of get into like these tit for tat type of things, you did this, well, you did that. I just kind of have already said like, okay, I'm going to disengage right now. I'm not feeling like I will be contributing something positive to this discussion, so I'm going to disengage. And it always gets me like, you don't want to hear what I have to say. You don't care about my feelings. It's your way or no way. And so I have to kind of just reiterate that I'm not saying that we can't talk about it. Just right now, it's not good for me. And I just kind of take that responsibility for my own feelings and actions and thoughts, and kind of just step away. And it, like Annabelle was saying, at the moment, it doesn't feel good to just kind of walk away, because I do have plenty to say. But it serves us better in the long run. We can kind of come back and we can both realize where we kind of took that left turn. And it's just that's why I was saying in the beginning earlier that it doesn't feel good to set the boundary or to receive the boundary all the time. But I do think that we are both better off because of, just any boundary for both of us.
Good. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's great. And yeah, sometimes there's going to be backlash, you know. Sometimes a partner does not accept boundaries lightly, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's very, very important. And I like the way you phrased it, because especially when it comes to talking boundaries, which are very important to set, talking boundaries are one of the most important boundaries to set, because unfortunately, there's probably very little that compares to the damage we can cause through our verbal altercations. That has the potential to cause such emotional damage, deep emotional damage. So being wise enough to cut off conversations, like you said, that are going left or south, that's a good move. And at the same time, we need to reinforce to our partner that me cutting off this conversation is not me cutting off you, even though you feel like it at the time, right? Even though you feel like, get out of here, right? But the reality is that you're not cutting off that person. You want to make sure that that person understands, I do want to hear what you say. I do want to understand your perspective. I am open to hearing your feelings. Right now, this isn't working, or right now you're choosing to be critical, or right now we're choosing to be critical. That's even a better way of saying it. We're choosing to be critical. We're choosing to yell at each other. This isn't working for me. I'm going to pull back for, an hour or a day, or let's regroup. That's not about not wanting to hear what you have to say. I'm totally interested in what you have to say. So that was good, Yolanda. I like that you said that. Good. Anybody else?
Granted, we don't always get there. Like I said, granted, we don't always make it to the boundary setting and the walking away. I do notice the difference between like walking away and just carrying on way left. Like I do notice the difference. So like just listening to you talk and everyone sharing, it's like, oh yeah, it's more like a common sense thing to me, but talking about it makes sense, but it doesn't always kind of work out that way when it's in the moment of 100%. That argument.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else want to share an example? Yes, Josh, please.
I'll share one that was a while back, like maybe a year or two ago, as a bad example, just to get some coaching. Okay. And so a couple of years ago, I decided that, professionally, being on time was important to me. Being early means you're on time, even if other people are late. Like I just decided that's going to be me.
Okay, good.
And, I thought nicely, and it's too far in the past to know how nicely I was asking. I'm pretty sure the first time I asked nicely. And then, the second time I expressed my, disappointment or displeasure of being made late, by somebody else, when being on time is accepted as the best thing to do, and then we were going on a trip, and I can't remember where, but basically, I was out in the car 5 minutes before we were ready to go, and I had pulled away, like I'd already driven away. And she comes out like 15 minutes later, and she's calling me. She's like, will you turn around and get me? I'm like just look to your right. And
it was 5 minutes, but go ahead.
It was 2 years ago, so you don't have to go there.
Okay.
And obviously that didn't go over well.
Right. Well, yes, no, that would not go over well. I do not recommend doing that for sure. You remind me, I have a good friend of mine who is so meticulous on time. I mean, he was born exactly to the second on time. It's like his whole life he's on time. He's just like you, like 5 minutes early is called on time. And for some reason, God decided to play this great joke on him, and he married him to a woman who literally does not know how to read a clock at all. She does not know what time of day it is. She knows nothing. For her, 20 minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes is all the same thing. And they're married. They're married with 10 kids. And this guy is like, he's been living with this woman for 35 years already, maybe more, and it's torture. It's just torture. But he's that kind of guy that, they say that they're going to leave for a family trip at 8:30 in the morning. He is literally sitting in the car at 8:30 in the morning with his hands on the steering wheel. She might not be ready to go till 11 o'clock that morning. I mean, she'll pop out at 8:30 and say, oh, I got to go shopping again, or oh, I got to go to the store to get another camping something or another. I mean, it's unbelievable. So I feel your pain. I understand what that means. It's just for people who want to be on time, and it's difficult.
I think I want to say something.
Oh, please.
I think what we can see here in just what we're discussing is that how complicated it is being married and living with someone and trying to get along when we all come from different backgrounds and different personalities. And I always say it's such a brave act to get married and to really try like living with someone in this way, because we're all so different, and like time means something different, and cleanliness means something different, and speaking to each other, like how is it, in your childhood home, people speaking, and how is it in someone else's childhood home? It's like, so it's such a brave act, that we can have like respect for ourselves and respect for our partners, that we're even trying, because I think it's such a huge thing. And then I think in some ways, like if we can get the communication down, if we can decide if it's a big deal enough to want to communicate about it and to set the boundary, because some things, I think a million things can go by during the day where it's just like, we just kind of let it go because it's just not worth it. But when it's something that is worth it and we can communicate about it, is just that it does have to do with like respect for another person. And I think that's just a huge deal, is that how can we be respectful towards each other,
Totally. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's going to segue into what I would say to you, Josh, in your situation. Setting a boundary of like always being on time is going to be a really difficult thing to do. It's not really so much a boundary at that point as it is an expectation or a desire. So your boundary that you set for yourself, so you're there on time, but you can't. I can't set a boundary. Well, I'm setting a boundary that you're going to be on time. That's not called a boundary, going back to our initial definition. So what that would be a request from Annabelle to make more of an effort, right? And I want to share with you something that my wife told me earlier today, which I thought was really great. And she said that, if something's really important to a person, they need to prep the other person that this is important. So knowing your situation, right? Knowing that a trip is coming up and that this is a problem in your marriage and your relationship, at least for you, right? Maybe it's not a problem for Annabelle, but it's an issue for you. You need to take responsibility to prep her and help her with that circumstance. So another way of approaching it is like, look, and my wife said to me today, she thought a great way of doing it, hold her, sit down with her 5 minutes, maybe it's the night before, maybe it's 2 days before, hold her hand, look at her in the eye and say, we're supposed to leave on Tuesday morning. It's always been difficult for us to leave the house at the right time. I'd love for us to put an extra effort to make sure that we're in the car by 8:30. Okay, that's the first thing. So you're sharing with her, and you're looking at her in the eye, and you're holding your hands, like letting her know. You didn't say it last week or the last time it happened, and then decide to drive off this morning, right? That's not going to work. You prep her 2 days in advance, and you say, and this goes for anything that's important to us, especially something like this, right? It's important to me that we leave on time. And then the next thing you do to up your game, especially as a hubby, is you say, I want to help you be ready by 8:30. What can I do to make it easier for you so that you're fully prepared at 8:30 we can leave, right? So maybe she's overwhelmed with her packing, or maybe she's trying to prepare something. She's got a report that she has to do, or maybe there's something that she's thinking about, or maybe there's something that you can do. Maybe she's taken on the responsibility of packing all the food, right? So maybe there's some way that something that you can do to take off her plate to help her be on time that morning, right? And that, I think, would go a long way in creating a unified feeling, of, instead of it being a litmus test of whether she loves you or not, it becomes a team effort into how do we get out of here together at 8:30. I don't know, does that kind of make sense to you a little bit?
Yes.
Good.
And I also wanted to say, David, that I think also it's like that, as I think it was Yolanda who said that it's like that love together that we have for each other, that it's that connection. And so that's when we know we want to either set a boundary or communicate something. It's kind of that leaning forward, that leaning in, holding, hands, looking the person in the eye and say, hey, like for me and my husband, we have this thing about the airport, like I grew up in a home where, my father was sitting there 2 hours before the plane left. And David's mother was running through the airport to make it on time. Completely different background. And so, this has been something for us all the time. So it's like, it would be like me leaning forward, holding David's hands and saying, hey, we're going to go on a trip. And it's not just like intellectually, like his mother was running through the airport and my father was sitting at the gate. It's also, I get scared. I'm not at ease until like we're at the airport. Once I'm at the airport, I'm like, okay, good, we're here. But so it's like leaning forward and just kind of even explaining that, saying like, hey, it's really important to me to be there, 2 hours ahead of time. I do get nervous about flying. I'm scared. And bring in the emotional piece. And then my husband would say, that's great. I hear you. And I'm not comfortable sitting at the airport for 2 hours ahead of time because I get bored or whatever it is. And so it's kind of like, how can we compromise and make this work? So, because we love each other, we want that connection. We want to make it work, and we want to respect each other, not just where we each come from and what we're used to, but also like the feelings. He'll be bored and just feel like he's wasting time. And I'll feel scared if we get there, if it feels like too late for me. So it's kind of like bringing that together as like a connection piece. So how can we make this work together? And then even with the compromise, but that would be like ideal in terms of boundary stuff, where it's like, how can we come together about this? And this is where I'm coming from. Where are you coming from? And that kind of connection thing.
Good.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure. Craig, what do you have to say?
A lot of that resonated pretty strongly. I was asked to do certain things for my wife, modify myself. And to me, it was like, I don't have a problem doing this. And I know the overall end goal of what she was desiring from me. Just that when he talked about making it a team effort and what can you do to make it work together, that's what struck me the most, is that what can I do to help, and especially in the idea of being late and everything else, because that rings true with my wife and I. But like, what can I do to help you achieve my boundary? So I'm the one saying, hey, I'd like to be there earlier than later. What can I do to help you achieve what I'm looking for? And I think that right there is the kind of the catalyst of it all, because then it's not placing everything on your partner's shoulders saying, you've got to follow through with what I'm asking you to do. And you're not just shoving it on them. You're saying, I'm here to help with us, with me getting to where we're going to go, or whatever it is. But it's teamwork, and it's a partnership, and you feel supported in that, rather than just being demanded or requested to do something.
Good. I like that very much. It's very powerful. Yes. Good. Sherry, did you want to add anything, or you're good?
I feel like maybe this is the graduate level course and I'm at the elementary level
Okay.
because I get to the place where I'm like, okay, the socks on the floor, like they make it randomly in the vicinity of the hamper, but not like in the hamper. Like you made the effort to get them close to the hamper. Why not inside the hamper? So, and I make jokes about it. And then I'm like, well, I made the joke. So inside the joke was the ask. And then I'm like, okay, well, forget it. Like, obviously so then I go in this story like, well, he doesn't care about me enough to actually put them in the hamper. And like, that's such a small effort. Like he doesn't care enough to make this teeny tiny effort. And then instead of then doing the boundary, I like, okay, well, I'm going to shut up about it. I'm going to do it myself because it's easier for me to do it myself than to continue to ask or put the boundary up. And then I get resentful. And then we just get into this weird haze of like quiet, not talking to each other, resentment that feels like there's no fight happening, but it's just this like thick haze of uncomfortability about walking into somebody's landmine. So I feel like I haven't gotten to the boundary place. Maybe I just need to be better at the initial ask place.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's important. Yeah. And I think both of you and Craig brought up two interesting points, which I want to talk about just real briefly. The first thing, Sherry, what you brought up was some things, and I just recently worked with a couple on this. Some things, part of marriage is eating crow. I mean, it's just part of marriage. We are going to find ourselves in situations which we don't like, finding ourselves doing things which we don't want to do, and finding ourselves behaving in ways which we think are unfair. And guess what? That's just part of what it means to be married. We all have to put on our grown-up boots and realize that there's going to be a large percentage of the way we behave that's going to be unpleasant for us. And the reason why we do that is because the end result of that is this edifice, this building, this marriage, this relationship that is much more important than the things that we're currently fighting about, right? So we all have to realize that if you think that marriage is going to be about getting your needs met or having your way, you're just in for a painful surprise, right? Marriage is about getting by with the least amount of your needs possible in order to create happiness in the home. This is the complete inverse. I'm not getting married to be happy. I'm getting married and hoping that I will get hurt the least possible amount in order for me to have a successful relationship. So the status quo is that we show up doing a lot of things that are uncomfortable for us. That's the status quo, right? I mean, I've been working for 30 years. How old am I? I'm 54. I've been working since I've been 24. And I've been supporting my wife, my first kid, second kid, third kid, fourth kid, fifth kid, and sixth kid. And I'm still doing it to this day. Right? That's just one example. I can come up with thousands of examples. Right? And over the years, I've added things which are also not pleasant in addition to work, whether it's taking care of the house, taking care of other things, doing other things for the community, doing things for friends. That's just life. So that's an important thing for us to realize, that a big chunk of our time is going to be, okay, how can we create a situation where, and the principle here is that peace is the ultimate goal. That's the principle. So I have to ask myself, before I make a request, before I say that this is in a positive way, before I make a request in a negative way, before I set a boundary, is this something that I am more comfortable doing myself rather than start up that whole process? It could be the answer is no, right? For sure, there's certain things that just bother me. Like I needed to take that laundry basket and clean my house. I didn't feel comfortable walking into my own home because my kids are making such a mess. And maybe for somebody, it's about the socks in the basket. And maybe for somebody, it's about the wet towels on the floor, or maybe whatever their issues are. So you have to make that calculation with the understanding that there's a very good chance that this thing that I don't like is just going to go into that big, 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 huge basket of other things that I don't like, and then doing that for the sake of the marriage. Good. And then I wanted to talk about something that Craig said and that we talked about with Josh, which is sometimes setting a boundary doesn't mean compromising. Sometimes setting a boundary can mean coming up with a constructive alternative. And I'll give you an example. I have a sister who lives about 15 minutes away. And X number of times a year, she invites us to come over. And for whatever the reasons are, my wife and I, for some reason, she's my older sister. I've always been a little bit afraid of her. And even though I'm 54 years old, I still am a little afraid of my older sister. So when she says to show up there at 8:30, even though I'm late to everywhere else, I like to be there at 8:30. Okay. And my wife, for whatever reason, is more relaxed because it's family maybe, or because she lives so close, or she's got so many things going on. And she's not ready. And like I said before, 99% of the time, I'm the one who's late. But for whatever twist of God's sense of humor, in this particular situation, she seems to be the one that has the relaxed, laissez-faire attitude about it. And I'm the one that's totally hyper. So, of course, it's nicer for everybody to pile into the car and go together as a family. That makes sense. But at some point, rather than fighting about it and arguing about it, I just said to my wife, hey, I'm taking the kids in this car. You show up whenever you want to show up. And that was a boundary that I set for myself. And, yes, it's much nicer when we all go together, and we always try to go together. Who wants to go to family events in two different cars? That's like kind of stupid, right? Like I didn't grow up doing that. My mom and dad always went together. That'd be so dumb. But it's dumb, but it works for us. This way, I came up with a boundary. Remember I said to you before, the goal of a boundary is to determine what it is that you don't want. It's not to punish your partner. What I didn't want to do is be late for my sister. And so I came up with a solution that enabled me not to be late for my sister. Does it feel good for my wife to drive there by herself? Maybe yes, maybe no. Okay, in this situation, it does. Okay? For
I
me,
get to go whenever I want.
She gets to go to shop. And this, I wouldn't like if the tables are turned, I wouldn't like that. I feel like, hey, you're leaving without me, right? But it's worked for us over the years, So now my sister says she's having an event. I don't even need to say to my wife. I just grab the keys. I say whichever kids are ready to go, and I get in the car and I go so that I'm on time. Josh, this is a good one for you, right? You can just get in your car and go if it's someplace that if it's a meeting, a community meeting that you and Annabelle are supposed to go to, and you're nervous about it, without trying to make her feel bad, without any guilt trips, without anything, you say, listen, I know you tend to show up a little late. I'm nervous about it. I'm just going to leave a few minutes before. I'll see you there. Right? Problem solved. You don't have to hold her hands and look in her eyes and ask 2 days in advance and all that kind of stuff. That's also great, especially when you can't go to the airport in two. I mean, it would be kind of weird to go to the airport in two different cars, to be honest. But things like this can be done. So sometimes boundaries just require you to be a little creative, a little outside the box, doing things a little differently, and you can get your needs met. Okay, does anybody have anything to say about what I've just talked about?
Kind of off topic of something you had said earlier. There was a moment where I broke a boundary with someone, and I didn't know that was a boundary for them. It was on a past wound to them, and it was something so minuscule that I did. I took something that was so small because I thought it could be beneficial to us for a car trip we were going to. Later, when that person found out that I took that item, you could visibly see that they were bothered and agitated by it. 20 minutes passed by, and that agitation really started to show.
Wow.
And for lack of a better term, I was kind of sent to the doghouse. And I don't know if you would define that as kind of like the extreme in that instance, like kind of like a punishment. But they rationalize it as, well, if I allow you to, if you don't learn your lesson now, you'll never do it. And that you may who knows what else you'll do if you did this to me.
Uh-huh. I hear that. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in a way, if they don't respond to a boundary violation and they don't express themselves, then they're correct. I mean, if there's no way you know you're doing something wrong, then you're just going to do it again as you did the first time, right? So they got that going for them. That makes sense. Obviously, I mean, it would seem clear to me that the first way that we deal with boundary violations is through just bringing it up in a more rational, compassionate, normal fashion. So putting somebody in the doghouse for violating a boundary they didn't even know was a boundary seems a little extreme to me. Is that how you felt at the time?
Yeah, at the time, I was in a situation where I was kind of stuck with that boundary. And I kind of had to do with it because otherwise it meant having to be physically somewhere else at that time. But yeah, at the time, it didn't sit well with me. I thought, why do I feel like I understand why this is important to them? I understand why that past wound is important to them, but I still feel at the same time I'm being punished. That's what was going through my head. Like, it was such an extreme where, as opposed to when they initially told me that it bothered them, I was like, okay, I understand that. I'm, not going to do that again. Like, crystal clear.
Right, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah, that sucks. And that's actually what I wanted. You can just lead me off to the last point before we wrap it up, which is how to accept.
Say something about that.
Oh, yes, please do. Yes.
It sounds like a boundary of yours was crossed also with that kind of communication too, meaning the way that person communicated to you that you made a mistake was crossing your boundary. And so that also is worth a conversation too. Yeah.
Totally good. Okay, so this last point that you're bringing up, Mark, will lead us to the last point that I want to talk about, which is how to accept boundaries. Okay, now again, as the recipient of a boundary, it can be painful, right? Because most of the time, you're the reason why you're the person setting a boundary in the first place, right? You're the cause of their discomfort. You're the cause of this, whatever triggered feeling is that they had since childhood, right? So that hurts, right? No one, if you're in a loving relationship, you don't want to be the cause of your partner's pain. And usually it goes deeper than that. Usually the first thing that people think of is when the boundary's set on them is that, hey, I did something wrong. I'm a bad person. And then, of course, the number one message that always comes up, I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable, right? On a deeper level, right? It's a rejection of me, right? Okay, that's normal to feel that way, right? Craig, I see you agree with that, huh? That's the way we all take boundaries. That's why, as a loving partner, we don't want boundaries to be our go-to. And when we do set boundaries, you have to be very sensitive, right? Because no matter how we say it, ultimately, this person's doing something that you don't like, and they're going to understand that they are, in your eyes, misbehaving on some level, and that hurts. Last time I was told I misbehaved was like by my dad when I was 9, right? So when my wife tells me that I'm misbehaving, it doesn't feel good, right? Okay. One important principle that we have to understand about boundaries, and I think this will help us just in general as the receiver, is that for the vast majority of boundaries that are set, it has nothing to do with you. It literally has nothing to do with you. Boundaries, as Mark said in the very beginning, which was that they're a result of some sort of internal, perhaps experience, or some experience that they've had in the past that they don't want to happen again. Or Craig said that it has to do with a person's own personal soul level understanding of how they want to be treated or what feels good for them, or what my wife talks about, which is that this is the way it feels in the body. None of that has to do with me, right? Like, I have nothing to do with that, right? So when somebody sets a boundary, it's important for us to decouple the I'm not good enough message from the request that's being made or the boundary that's being set. It's very important. And I can tell you, as somebody who's had boundaries set on him, that that's been a very liberating thought for me. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not misbehaving. It doesn't mean that my behavior can't improve. It doesn't mean that I am not doing something, that I am doing something It doesn't mean that I'm not doing something inappropriate. It doesn't mean a lot of things. I do have to self-reflect. And if my wife is setting a boundary, or if my boss is setting a boundary, or if my rabbi is setting a boundary, I should look in the mirror and say, hey, wait a second, what's going on over here, right? And that is an exercise I should go through. But at the same time, I also have to understand that this is more about, I could have married somebody who was also late all the time, or I could have married somebody who always lost their keys just like me, or I could have been in a relationship where this didn't matter to this person. It could have been that way, and that would have been a perfectly fine situation. So the fact that my wife has differences than me, and she has feelings that arise from those differences, isn't necessarily a negative perspective on me. It just means that I'm behaving in a way that's triggering her. That's all. Not that I'm misbehaving, although, like I said, I do want to reserve the possibility for that as well, but that's between me and God, and me. What I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm respecting the way she is expecting me to show up in her life and the way that works for her, and not take it personally for me. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. That's not always easy to do, but it's very, very, it's very, very beneficial when we can do that, because ultimately that enables us to honor our partner's boundaries and their needs. So I do have an article on that, which I will email all of you who've shown up for the class. It's called How to Accept Boundaries, and I'll send it to you. I have all your emails, so I'll include that in the follow-up materials. But yeah, it just talks about how important it is for when we're the recipient of boundaries to bear in mind that this isn't necessarily about me as a person, and that those messages that come up and the anger that might come up or the frustration is not necessarily appropriate, because it's really about what our partner needs, not having almost anything to do with our own behavior. Does anybody have any thoughts about that, or has anybody experienced anything like that? Yes, Craig, you'd like to share with us?
Oh, I'm the king of taking things personally. I mean, that seems to be the difficult part, is that when you're explaining your boundary to somebody, say, it bothers me when you do this. How are you not supposed to take that personally, right? Like, you're the one that does this. Well, okay. But, you said something that kind of stayed with me there about, there might be, in certain occasions, past issues, past situations or traumas that have come up that your partner or whoever is, asking to set the boundary, they've endured something at that point that does set a trigger within them. And I know personally from my wife, all of the horrible men that she's dated, and it takes just a smidge of me doing something that automatically then triggers her and puts her in those past relationships. And that was something that I never really fully, I understood it. We've been friends for 22 years. Over half our life, we've been friends. And so while I knew all of that was happening, as we were just friends at the time, I never really understood the weight that carried once we actually got married, and that those things that I did or said, and that the way that triggered her and then made her feel. And of course it was, well, when you do this, it's like, well, why is it me? And I didn't fully take the weight of that into consideration. And I took a lot of things personally. Now, am I the one doing it? Yeah, I'm the one doing it. But it was like, man, why'd she get so bent out of shape about that?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lack of understanding about where that came from. So And the fact that you're not good enough or not lovable, that was just something that's been reiterated over a couple different counseling groups that I've been in. So for you to say that, I thought, wow, I'm in the right place.
Well, I am a counselor, so there you go.
I'm in the right place. So yeah, it's about what your partner needs and not taking it personally and trying to even maybe ask those probing questions to identify, hey, why do you feel that way? Where did that come from? How long have you felt like that? And maybe that takes part of the heat off me and allows that person or her to start diving into where that really is, where that trigger is pulling from.
Yeah, those are all very helpful approaches to this situation for sure. Definitely, and they're very, and the way you're expressing it's very compassionate, because you're in the way you're doing it, you're trying to help her uncover what some of her limitations are and what walls she's put up for herself and for your relationship in general. So that's nice. That being said, so it's also very important for you, Craig, to disassociate her requests from you from your self-worth. It's really, really important. So on some level, on a personal level, you want to go to in my opinion, you want to go to the other extreme. You want to say, this is what I recommend for men especially. I don't care what your reasons are for requesting this behavior change. I don't care what your reasons are for setting up this boundary. This is not about me, this is about you, right? And therefore, I'm willing to do it. I know it sounds a little crazy, but it's not intuitive. I don't want to dive into her. To help her, I want to dive into her reasons. That's for her. It's a gift I can give to her. But for me, I want to say, okay, I hear that you don't like behavior A, B, and C. I'm fine with behavior A, B, and C. I think A, B, and C is great. If you were to do A, B, and C to me, I'd love it. But I hear that you don't want that. So, okay, that's something. Is that something I can do for you? Yeah, it is. Maybe. I mean, you'd have to work it out for yourself. If it is something, that you can do. So I find that for me, removing myself from the drama helps me better accommodate the people in my life whom I want to respect, whose boundaries I want to respect. How does that sound for you when I say that? Are you with me when you hear me say that? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. I mean, again, it's not saying that you are acknowledging the request.
100%.
And at the same time, it's not this psychoanalytical, well, how does that feel for you? And trying to get behind her reasonings. Obviously, the logic of it isn't what they're looking for, right? They want the emotional part of that.
And if you can, and if at some point you want to dive in and say, you know what, I understand that, putting chili sauce on the tacos really sends you into an emotional tailspin. Like, where's that coming from? That's a nice gift you can give her, to be there as a husband and as somebody who loves her and cares about her. Whatever, that was just an example, but you don't need to do that. You don't need to do that. And oftentimes, it's more liberating, at least for me, and I've worked with other men, to kind of bypass that whole thing and just be like, okay, not interested in all the drama over here. I hear what you have to say. It doesn't work for you. I get it. This isn't about me. It's about something that's important to you. I want to support you, and I'm willing to.
It's much more of a surface level accommodation than it is digging down into the soil and finding the root of the problem.
Yes. Anybody else have thoughts on that type of approach?
What Craig said was, it's new it's like a insight for me. Something that I can kind of take away from here is to not always be concerned, like you said, Craig, the psychoanalyst part, like always be concerned and trying to understand why they're asking for, a certain thing or why they're reacting in a certain way. Just kind of hearing the request or the boundary and saying, okay, I care about, your happiness, our happiness, and this is what I can do. It's not something that's too hard for me, or it doesn't cross like my own boundaries or cause a problem with me. So instead of trying to dig deep into why they want this or why they react this way, just kind of, like you said, acknowledge that I hear you, I understand the request, and yes or no, I can do this.
It's great. Jolanda, I'm always so happy that you're here with us in the class.
I'm happy to be back.
You always say the smartest things.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, Josh, how does that sound for you when I say that?
I mean, it makes sense because, it's better to take responsibility for your own actions than to go somewhere where another person might not want to go,
Uh-huh.
So it keeps the peace.
Yes. Number one priority. Annabelle, what do you think?
I think I look forward to reading that article on how to accept boundaries. One thing that's been helpful for me is that to recognize that we're very different people. Like I'm me and Josh is you, you guys are you guys. And, when I'm bothered by another person's behavior also means that other people can be bothered by my behavior. So when I have boundaries, when I feel like, oh, you're violating my boundaries. It's a two-way street. I could be violating other people's boundaries, and I mean, by saying that, it's given me a path, like an empathetic path to I guess not take things personally, by truly believing that, hey, we all have free will, we all have things that we prefer, prefer way of handling things. And so I think when I can get to that understanding, then it takes me to a better place, a more grounded place, and to be like, okay, what do you need? What can I do?
Yes. Good. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. And I know that you and I have talked about the idea of, low-hanging fruit, like the idea of, if your partner comes up to you with a request or something, a boundary, sometimes it's easier. If it's possible to do without getting into the reasons, it's like a huge win, right? Because we have to realize that as difficult as it is for us to set a boundary, if we're doing something in the relationship that caused our partner to set a boundary, that means that they're very distressed, right? Because like I said, no one sets a boundary rarely do people set boundaries lightly. So if your partner is coming up to you with something that's important to them, a boundary, for instance, that means that they're already on like DEFCON 3 or 4, or maybe even 5. So if it's something easy that we can do without getting into the details, without trying to have them justify it, without trying to figure out the why, and just be like, oh, okay, well, if you're asking me, that means that this is something for real for you, then yeah, that's something, and it's something that you can do easily. It's just like, yeah, I'll take that. I'll take that, 10 times out of 10, because I know that I've just scored a huge win with my wife. If she comes to me like, with this boundary, and I'm like, okay, no problem. It's like, whoa, that's the way to go. Anyway, Sherry, did you want to add something, or you're good?
So I am thinking of a situation, like I will give an example. that has been polarizing in my family, but maybe in other people's families, like the situation with COVID, for instance, and like how somebody feels comfortable with being out in the world. And I'm just using this as an example because it's a present example. And my husband and I maybe feel similarly-ish about our comfort or not comfort about being in the world. But I maybe am more relaxed, like, I'm going to go with the flow. If this person feels like they need to take these cautions, well, then I'll be very cautious around them. But if they don't feel very cautious, then it doesn't matter to me. It's fine. But my husband has very like staunch in his beliefs. And so it's not impacting me per se, but impacting how I get to interact with the rest of the world based on his feelings about how he has to be in the world with this. So his boundary interacts with how I'm able to interact with my surroundings. And so I can honor his boundary, but being in that we're together and we're out in the world, I don't know if I'm making any sense.
I totally understand what you're talking about.
I don't know how to make sense of like honoring his boundary, and yet I'm maybe a little less boundaried about this, and I'm okay to sort of just, this person feels this way. I can meet that person where they're at. I don't feel so strongly about I have to hold on tight to this principled way of being.
Right. It's a great example, and it's a very relevant example, and it's a very complicated example because it spans all the way from the way you are in the home to the way you show up at work, to the way you go grocery shopping, to the way you speak to your mother. It touches on everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, it does.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really difficult also is that it's like, it's not about you. It's like you're carrying on your shoulder your husband's request. You're walking around with this, and it's not even your thing. It's like, I can only say that this challenge is, I'm sure, very, very difficult. I mean, can anybody here imagine what it would be like in a home if one person believed strongly that they do not want to wear masks, and the other person believes strongly that you cannot walk out of the house without a mask? I mean, if they really felt that way, I don't even know, it would be a disaster, because to the person who believes that you need to wear a mask, it's like life and death. Like, to that person in their mind, it's like life and death. And to the person who doesn't want to wear the mask, it's like freedom. Like, I'm not giving up my freedom for anybody, So it's like you have these two forces pulling at each other in the opposite directions. Thankfully, nobody's come to me with that problem, because I really wouldn't know what to say. I really wouldn't know what to say. But sometimes I think, Sherry, you're bringing up a good point. And this is a little nuanced. And I'm glad my wife's not on the call right now. Okay, so the nuanced part is like this. Sometimes, she said she's here. The nuanced part is like this. Sometimes, I know this will sound like a little like a chess game, but sometimes we have to counter boundary. So a counter boundary would be, this is what you want. You want A, B, and C. I'm willing to do A, or I'm willing to do A, B and a half, or I'm willing to do A and B, right? And what that means is that we're not taking on the onus of the other person's boundary completely. I think, Yolanda, you mentioned that earlier when you said, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do, right? That's also an important part in relating to boundaries. A partner requesting a boundary isn't a sentence from a judge. It's not a whatever those things are called when the judge bangs down the gavel and says, this is that's not what that is. It's a request, and you're in a process of negotiation. And we have to be able to set our own boundaries, even in the face of our partner's boundaries as well. And sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes people are left in a kind of a situation where, yes, I'm willing to be on time for the airport, but no, I'm not willing to be on time for the theater. or yes, I'm willing to put my clothes in the bin, but I'm not willing to hang up clothes that I'm going to be wearing the following day, right? Some, especially guys, tend to wear similar clothes, more than once before they wash them. So they'll just leave them on the chair by their bed before they go to bed. They don't want to hang them up and put them away, right? They don't want to, even though their wife may say, well, that leaves the room messy. But the guy's like, I'm going to bed. I literally will be wearing these clothes in about 8.5 hours from now. I'm not going to hang it up. I don't know, but if anybody saw the movie called Along Came Polly, with Ben Stiller and Jennifer Aniston. And anyway, he was married to this woman who loved these throw pillows. So she used to put hundreds of throw pillows, or a dozen, you saw that, a dozen throw pillows on the bed. It's a great funny movie. If anyone's seen it, it's called Along Came Polly, I think it's called. And eventually he just like totally exploded. He took this knife and he started stabbing all these pillows that are on his bed. These are the stupidest thing. Every morning I put them on, and then at night I have to take them away. And sometimes we just have to say no to our partner's boundaries, which is also not comfortable. But sometimes that's also for our own self, for our own worth and our own self, sense of self and being authentic with ourselves. So Sherry, in your circumstance, I'm not telling you what to do in it by any means, but it could be that you could say to your partner, I hear that this bothers you. A, B, and C bothers you. A, B, and C do not bother me in the least. I'm willing to do for you A, B. I'm not willing to do C. You see what I'm saying? So you're respecting your partner, but you're also being true to yourself. And that may cause some discord. That may cause some distance, but it's up to the two of you. Marriage is a game that two of us play. It's not a singles game. So your partner has to be responsible to say, I have a wife. Your partner has to look at it like, wow, A, B, and C are not important to my partner at all. She's doing A and B for me. I've got a great partner. Right? They can't walk around and say, well, she's not doing C for me, so therefore she doesn't care about me. That wouldn't be a healthy perspective. If I was their counselor, I would say, wow, out of the 3 things that you're asking, she's doing 2, you got to keep her. Right? And for the person who's, trying to accommodate their partner, let's say in your situation, Sherry, I would say, wow, that's amazing that you're willing to do A and B for your partner. If you can't do C, I get it. So that's also part of this whole dynamic where, we don't always end up saying yes. We don't always totally say no. Sometimes we say yes to the extent that we can. And after that, comes a kind, gentle, compassionate no. Does that make sense, Sherry? It's not easy. Being married isn't easy. In any case, I know it's way past our bedtime over here. I really appreciate everybody showing up and participating and sharing. That's the best part. I always like to hear everyone's voice and their stories and their wisdom. Jolanda, especially yours, you seem to say such good things. And everybody here had what to contribute. And I appreciate my wife for being participating with me. And thank you guys very much. You can always find me. The easiest way to find me is online at David Feldman at Twitter, or of course my famous blog, davidfeldman.com. You can go there. This masterclass will be posted there. So in case you guys want to see it, I'll send you all a link to it when it's up, and we'll make a podcast out of it. My wife and I do couples therapy together. So if anybody needs some couples work, they can do a couples workshop with us where it's like 15 sessions. My wife and I do it together. And I also do personal work with men, or personal work with men or women. If you just want some private sessions, usually I have packages of 6 to get you back on, go through any issues that you're facing. And you can always hit me up for a free clarity call, and you can just find that at davidfeldman.com. And it's been a real pleasure. So everybody have a great evening, and thank you very much.
Dakar